see.
Well, I will say this. I go to the pockets. I actually am in lash rehab, so which is why I have my glasses on. We'll talk about that later.
That's gotta be a friend pic.
She showed me her pouch full of glasses. Okay, you would pass out with the glasses she's got in her pouch.
I love it.
Yes.
I switch up as well.
Lashes actually take 10 years off. So,
She said lashes rehab. Now I'm trying to stare at your
Well, no,
lashes.
because I've been doing them myself. Right. And sometimes they're like up here, and so now I'm like, I'm hiding them. But yes. So we have to do a selfie from far away.
Okay.
But no, so I'm thinking about like my parents were first generation college students.
Okay.
And their families.
Mm-hmm.
My parents went to college before or during, segregation was real at that time, right? They had to go to segregated schools. That was the law.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it was a law because Brown versus Board was 50 years ago.
Right?
Yeah, so it was after Brown versus Board when they were
In that
college.
transition.
It was Jim Crow.
Where
It was still very much-
they were not enforcing that
Absolutely.
And it was in the South.
integration.
And so even your best, brightest, most brilliant scholars, you know, their first choices in many cases or options happen to be HBCUs.
Right.
And so they had a lot of deep pride with that, but they were also part of a movement. Right? They were the first in my community, black teachers, among the first to integrate an all-white faculty at my local high school. And so they had a movement. My mom marched when she was in college. Like, they had a real movement.
Right.
My generation was the first generation to not have a movement.
Right.
Like, we had no movement, and our parents made sure, and I mentioned my father really, like, demanding that I attended his alma mater because he knows that he was nurtured, he was taken care of. Like, he knows that that will be a place where culturally, socially, historically, that's a place that has really built the intellectual and social giants and scholars, right? So we come along, this is where the 80s baby comes in. Like, we come along in the Huxtables era and the Fresh Prince, and we're benefiting, from the sacrifices of our parents and our grandparents. And then, of course, my generation started having kids, and that's like the era of entitlement. And it's not their fault, right? So they had every game system. My kids have never been around where there was not internet, right? They had
They're
phones.
true millennials.
Yeah. And even before I knew there was such a thing as millennial, like, we were working to just kind of give them so much that they've lost their sense of kind of fight. And then I believe by the time they get into high school and they're looking at the future, things are not as easy as they thought. So my generation seems to be the first generation where our kids may not be as educated as their grandparents. Not their parents, but their grandparents.
Yeah. And I think that was similar to the stat that I read. I have random stats everywhere in my head, but it was like they will actually not make as much money as us because they'll actually fall a whole bracket, and when does that happen? That middle class child raised in a middle class family grows up in poverty. Like, that is an African American specific. That's not across the board.
It might be across the board, though. I'm doing some research about that now.
Okay.
It might be across the board because of student loan debt.
Well, yeah.
So seriously, people are going to get these degrees and advanced degrees, and because of that, they're taking on so much debt that they
already start off behind.
They're behind. Yeah. Well, wow. Just some food for thought. And I do love that HBCU plug. I love to talk about Thune-Cookman University.
Is that where you attended?
Yeah, my alma mater.
I didn't know that.
Yes, and Mary McLeod Thune.
Yes, ma'am.
Mother of education. We did a segment a while back ago called "Divorce is a Lie."
The divorce is a lie. The devil is a lie.
The divorce is a lie. And we interviewed one of our colleagues from Black Educators Rock, and she's in Florida, so it was really interesting. The opinion of her going to.
Did they actually hold the degrees of those students who? I know that was a threat made.
No.
Okay.
I know, girl.
That would have.
I know. Update.
Yeah, shout out to class of 2017.
They did not hold those degrees.
And he's actually stepped down. That was an update. Yeah. Well, he was not stepped down, but he is not there no more. There's an interim president acting now.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, yeah. I love just teacher talk. And I feel like we're mixing in a little bit of friend thing, so that's kind of cool too.
I am. There's so much that I have thought about as I'm sitting in this little rolly chair. So we've spoken a lot about the dynamics of, I guess we could say, African American parental empowerment. Just empowering parents to know that they need to take a stand in your child's educational life. So just kind of switching gears a little bit, from a teacher's perspective, an educator's perspective, I know that as I'm in and out of teachers' classrooms, and I'm with a lot of teachers who are not minority teachers, and this can go for both minority and teachers who are not minority. We have reverse racism, we have things, that go, different dynamics that go on with educators. So, but I'm kind of intrigued in how we're raising up the next generations and how we are setting them up to have a certain ideal towards different groups of people. So what do you think, what part do you think educators play in influencing children and their acceptance and treatment of others? Because I know just from being an administrator and looking at and observing teachers, I can see when some teachers are ostracizing certain types of children, and then that spirit comes off on the kids within the classroom. Yeah. So I have kind of challenged our teachers to use their voice in order to kind of be an equalizer.
There's a really large county, I can't say what county in Georgia, that they actually called two superintendents within that county to the NAACP panel and asked them directly, why doesn't the population reflect the faculty? So I'm not leading your answer in any kind of way, but this last week, this panel went on, and the answers were very interesting. One principal who is Hispanic was ashamed. The other, or not principal, superintendent who was Hispanic was ashamed. The superintendent who was not Hispanic mentioned, and we talked about that there are a lack of African American educators, and so that's the reason why it doesn't match the population.
No, we didn't talk about that there was a lack. That was one of the excuses that I received when I called a system on the carpet about not having their faculty reflect the demographics of their students within the building. And that was the excuse that there are no black teachers who are
actually, they're right. There are no black teachers on their list of candidates to interview.
Absolutely.
Right. There are, I've heard that, and I know that there are scholars out there who can probably, and scholars of color, who can, show that the numbers show that there are not.
But we're
in my family alone, my family, there are 10 educators. In my family. So I know where you can find 10. And there are schools that only have 3.
And you can find 8, and probably in my family. So it's like, between us, 18 teachers.
Right. Now think about my hometown, where everyone in our friend circle, my parents' circle, were educators. The people who attended our church, they were educators.
Yeah.
All of the civic organizations my parents were a part of, they were educators. Because teaching was your entryway into the black middle class, right? So think about how many teachers or folks who've been trained to teach actually exist. The disparity comes in when they're looking during the selection process.
That's it.
For teachers, right? And if you really want to find your teachers of color, look in your special ed classrooms. Look at those who are charged with discipline. Right, and look at the schools that are predominantly African American and some of your urban districts. You will see that they're not putting their, teachers from more or less diverse backgrounds in some of those communities and schools and disciplines. So I can't remember what the question was.
Was the influence of educators on their own students?
Well, see,
is that a responsibility, or is that
always whenever an adult is charged with the care and well-being and instruction of a child, then they have a significant amount of responsibility and accountability. The problem, though, exists is that we're asking teachers to be something and do something and have something that they just don't, right? Because they're still just people and they're people with their own experiences, their own realities or sense of reality, their own biases. And so until we peel back some of that and get teachers to start talking, because there's no so that's actually one of my projects I'm working on, my book title is The Hidden Curriculum, because there are things that we're just not taught, but you have to know, right? So you can't give teachers...
I love that. Say the title again.
It's so cute. I love
I know you don't want to uncover your secrets.
I know, because I have two things I'm working on at the same time, and my publisher is telling me, focus on one. I'm like, no, I have two I'm working on. Hopefully she won't hear that. But yeah, so there are the things that we must know but are not taught, right? Yeah. And so there's no teacher's manual, teacher's edition on empathy.
Right.
There's not a class that I'm aware of in the two colleges where I've taught and the 3-4 that I've attended where there's a class on common sense and kindness. Right. And just be doing what's right for people. And I will say that schools are microcosms of the larger society.
Absolutely.
And so whatever you see out there, it also exists within schools. And so what we have to do is hold people, create the culture that we want, model, and then hold people accountable.
Absolutely. So we have a segment called The Elephant in the Room, and then I'm just about to segue into one of them because I just thought of it. So we had this conversation, and if we talked about this on the last podcast, let me know, but I feel like this was one of our sidebars.
Yeah, because you never know when I push play.
Nope. I had no idea. I
just like, this is good.
So, elephant in the room, and it just makes me so uncomfortable. So we did talk about it. So I wasn't there. Let me get your opinion. Okay. So I have an issue. It was 2 comments made by this one teacher. And again, we have to handle things with care because we want to educate and reshape the way that they, the rhetoric. So one thing that this particular teacher said, it was about an African American male first grader, and it was day 3 of school, and just talking about how, oh my gosh, day 2 he was already isolated. So I already had an issue with that. I'm like, you hadn't even given the child a chance to build a relationship with him. But anyway, we're not gonna go into all that. So the comment was, if I could just take him home. And it makes me twitch because my husband and I always have discussions about these things. And I know we do that with all of our husbands. But he's like, so he's a puppy, like, so you can go home and train him and break him, and that's kind of what we started talking about things not to say. Like, so you're going to save this child, like, what is it that you think that you're going to do that's so great?
She needs to see Birth of a Nation. She needs to see what happened when someone took Nat Turner home.
Yeah. Right. I mean, and also, teachers should be students of their students. So you have to
study and
learn. You have to learn what it is that you even think you're going to change.
So for me, it's important that teachers see in the student their own child.
Absolutely.
It's true.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
See, when you look at that brown boy or brown girl, do you see your blonde haired child?
Right.
If that child does not deserve the things that your little poo-poo deserves, then you are not in the right